What does it mean to become a global citizen?
We are globalized, at least for goods, services, but certainly for capital.
There is a trend of increasing nationalism inside different countries.
In our case, we are poor in energy. 80% of our energy is imported. You can't say I'll cut myself off from the world and rely on my big domestic market.
You've worked extensively with Mr. Manmohan Singh. How is he as a boss?
One thing I saw with all three of them was they would never say, oh, this is good for my party, me and my election.
Is being globalized better?
India and China were unified within about 100 years of each. Hard power is only two things, military and economic. There are so many sanctions on Russia. But has it stopped her from doing what she's doing in Ukraine?
What will a country like India do if one of our neighbors pull off the...
So when the Sri Lankan army is defeating the LTT, you support the Tamil people. You might say there's a 70% probability, but you don't know 100% what they'll pull out. There's no international policeman who goes around saying, oh, you broke the law, why have you done this? But actually life is complicated and that's the joy of it. It's never a simple calculus. When I joined the Foreign Service, I had no idea what the Foreign Service was. So I asked my father, what do I do? Remember, whoever you deal with, president, chauffeur, whatever, they're all human. Mearsheimer, political scientist, IR scholar, he wrote a book called Why Leaders Lie. He came to the conclusion that
the AI thing, which is a buzzword now, how is it affecting the world of international relations?
with every new technology, you hear the same thing. Oh, it must be controlled. It's very dangerous. I think AI can negotiate with itself. I'm not sure it can negotiate with people. If you want to test any theory, try it on China and see if it works. How China escaped the poverty trap, that's the big question.
Greetings, everyone. In this edition of Exploring Minds, we have a very interesting guest, Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, who was the former National Security Advisor, a Foreign Secretary, Ambassador to Pakistan, China, Sri Lanka, Israel. And he's the man who can give us a tutorial on everything. So thanks a lot for doing this, sir. Really grateful.
For having me. Thank you.
The previous decade of India, of the world, they say we are becoming more and more globalized, sir. But for a 22-year-old who's watching this, what does it mean to become a global citizen?
That's a big question. It's true, we are globalized in the sense that, at least for goods, to a lesser extent for services, but certainly for capital, the world is now one open economy, and there's only one economic system in the world today, unlike the Cold War. You know, there's one Western capitalist economy, and trade is a very high proportion of GDP. I mean, it's since 2011, it's been between 55 and 60%. So it's fairly steady over time. So people who tell you, oh, we're deglobalizing this, that, it's not actually happening. Trade is still more than half of our GDP in the world. So we are in a globalized world, but we're also globalized in another way, digitally, thanks to the internet, thanks to ICT, basically. I mean, we can see, hear things from across the world, whether it's music, we can see how other people live, what they think. Ideas can spread across the world. So in that sense, it's a very globalized world. Can you be a global citizen? Because citizenship involves loyalty to something, to a state or to an idea. There's no global state. There's no global government, there's no global organization. People talk in vague terms of an international community. But frankly, the global world is still anarchic in many ways. Some areas of life are regulated. People have agreed a set of rules, like for the economy and so on, so that they can. But in many important respects, the use of violence, conflict, politically, the world is relatively anarchic. And the UN is not a world government, and it's only as effective as states are, because it's composed of states, and if states fight, then the UN can't work. So how can you be a global citizen? It assumes that there is some global interest which you will serve, right? But different people define that differently.
Right.
So, it's a good ideal to work for. That, I want to work for all of humanity. I'm not bound by boundaries. I'm in a world where this is possible thanks to digital connectivity, thanks to the globalized nature of the world economy. But I think one has to know also that this is an ideal. It's not necessarily something that you can practice every day or right now. Maybe it's something that's worth working to. And many people have in the past, in IR, you'll see IR theory, people used to talk of one world, that we need one world government, otherwise, the world will explode because now we have the means to destroy ourselves. We have atom bombs and so on. But it's still an ideal, it's a hope, it's not really. And you hear less and less of that today. In today's politics, you don't hear much talk of one world around, unlike the period between the wars when even US presidential candidates, Wendell Willkie and so on, used to speak of one world. Jawaharlal Nehru used to speak of one world before India became independent. And even after, for a while, saying, yes, that's the ideal we should work for. But so it's hard to say that you can today be a global citizen, but as an ideal, it can promote responsible behavior.
I see.
And you can think about the effect of what you're doing on other people.
As far as I understand, there is a trend of increasing nationalism inside different countries, which is kind of giving, which is increasing the trade barriers where the countries want internal organizations, internal manufacturing to flourish. And that's bringing some kind of trade barriers. So, how do you see is being globalized better, or is being more nationalistic, giving more focus on internal economy? How do you balance between what's the right approach?
There has to be a balance, and it depends on each country's resource endowment. Well, there are some countries who just don't have the resources to be self-reliant, to depend on themselves. The market is too small, they can't. So they want a globalized world because it gives them access to materials, to commodities, to markets, and technology and so on. There are other countries who have huge markets, India, China, the US, So for them, yes, it makes sense. Why did the Europeans band together in a European common market and then the EU? Because their individual markets were small, and after the war had shrunk. They were no longer the great powers that they were in the 19th century. So they created one big market, but they needed each other. So it was a first step towards globalization, and it's regionalization, but as a step towards engaging with the world. So there's no one answer saying this is the formula. So much of domestic and so much of international. Xi Jinping uses a phrase about dual circulation economy, meaning the external circulation, which is imports, exports, trade, all that, and the internal circulation, which is domestic consumption, which drives the economy, and that you need to find a balance between the two. And each one will find, depending on their resource endowment, their geography, their ability, what they have. In our case, for instance, we are poor in energy. Until we can tap into solar or other nuclear or other renewable forms. So we need energy from the world. 80% of our energy is imported, actually. So we don't have non-ferrous metals. We have tremendous reserves of ferrous metals, but we don't have copper. We need, all these are things we need and we need technology and so on. So how do we pay for that? Unless we export. So you can't say, I'll cut myself off from the world and I'll go home and rely on my big domestic market. You tried that for a while in the 60s when you tried import substitution and so on. And the record shows that you need the world. Because the years when you opened up to the world are the years when you did best. Your high growth years were really in the noughts in the first decade of this century, when you grew faster than ever before or ever after, even in this decade.
Post-LPG.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So we have to find our balance. It will change the balance because as we develop our own capabilities, then we will be able to do more. But we can't do without global supply chains. I mean, as I said, if 55 to 60% of world GDP is traded across international borders, it tells you something, that people need each other.
Can't sustain.
That you can't just live in your own little silo. You can, but you'll live very poorly.
For example?
Well, Albania in the 60s, 70s, when Enver Hoxha just locked it up and wouldn't let anyone in, anything out. But they lived a miserable life.
आपने बोला था you were wanting to, you enrolled in a PhD program, then you joined an IFS.
Actually, I did ancient history, ancient Indian history.
From Stephens.
From Stephen and Arts Faculty, Delhi University. And I was interested, and I was learning Chinese and Sanskrit. And I was interested actually in ancient China, ancient India.
What?
Because they're very similar, Qin China and Mauryan India. India and China were unified within about 100 years of each other. 317 BC Chandragupta Maurya and 221 BC Qin Shi Huang in China. And very similar empires, autocrat, Iron Age, they'd opened up the lands, the big army, militarized. And both had manuals of kingship written for them. Kautilya, Chanakya, and for him, Han Feizi, for Qin Shi Huang. So I thought I'd do a PhD looking at ideas of king. How do you rule? Because even though they are similar, contemporaneous in historical terms, they have completely different ideas of how to run a state, why to run a state, what the state should do of kingship. So I thought I have a PhD, but I wanted to see China. And, in the late 60s, early 70s, China was closed, Cultural Revolution, and there were only two ways of seeing China. You could become a Naxalite, a guerrilla, or you could join the Foreign Service. So I said, I'll try my luck. I did the exam. I never thought I'd get in. But I'd registered for a PhD, and I thought, if I get in, I'll go and see China, because I did Chinese for the exam. In those days, you could do foreign languages for the UPSC exam. So I did Chinese for and language is like math, right? Either you know it 100% or you don't know it, 0. So I was lucky. I happened to know what they asked me. And I got in. So I thought I'll see China for 3 years and I'll come back. But then I got hooked, because the job they gave me was doing China's internal politics. And it was fascinating, because it was the period, the end of the Cultural Revolution. Zhou Enlai died, Mao Zedong died. Our ambassador came for the first time in 17 years. We had an ambassador in China. So the relationship also changed. And Chinese politics, the Gang of Four fell, Deng came back, and reforms started. So it was quite a time. It was an exciting time in China.
Which year was this?
I was there 74, 77 in Peking, and then here in the desk in the ministry, dealing with China after that until 79. And then Mr. Vajpayee went as foreign minister in 79 and so on. So it was an exciting time, and I got hooked. I just enjoyed the job so much. After that, I never went back. So that's why I say I never finished my PhD.
China is an interesting country, because, one thing which fascinates me, that there is no concept of a god in that country. And God means a different...
Not in our sense of the word. Yeah,
they mean spirit.
They have an idea of nature, of forces which work and so on, but not in the deification sense, in the Western or Levantine sense of a god who manipulates things, and not that kind of god. What they do is they deify. They trace their ancestry back to the person who invented agriculture or the person who taught them hunting and fishing. And they made them into gods. But these are, at least in their tradition, human beings who did great things. The god of war, Kuan Yin, was a historical figure and died actually in battle. But because he's known as a very great general, he's treated as the god of war. There are temples to him. And, soldiers go and pray for success at his temples. But it's not God in the sense that you and I would think of God. But then, what we think of as God in India also is not the same as what the Jews or the Christians think of as God, and what Hindus think of. When you say Brahman, that's not a concept that, whereas the Christians will tell you the Son of God. These are ideas that are more complicated. So I think the trouble is we use the same words. We call all these religions. They're not all identical. Chinese religion, so-called Confucianism, legalism and all, this is not religion. This is more political philosophy.
I see.
Even in ours, it's more philosophy, and if you look at the 6 schools, Sankhya and so on, these are actually schools of philosophy. But they all say religion, Hindu religion, but it's not really.
But you spent more than 2 decades in China, sir?
Not really, no. I spent about 12 years of my life.
Tell us certain things that we as a nation should learn from China?
Well, it's, I think their situation is very different from ours. In China, the state has always counted for a lot. In India, society has always been much stronger.
Give us an example.
Well, I mean, you look at our political history. I mean, you've had a few big empires, but the empire is not what determined everyone's lives. It was the social structure that actually carried India and that supported, thinking, all the mathematics that we did, all this came out of society. Whereas in China, it's all the state-sponsored. All the clergy, all the priests, whether they are Buddhist or Christian or whatever in China, have always been government servants, paid for by government. The state's role in China has always been tremendous, right from the beginning, from day one, from 221 BC. But in India, that's not so. The Shreni has its own place. I mean, frankly, it's a working society. And the king is part of that. And even when you read Kautilya, you see that.
And how does it happen? Why does a country evolve in such a way?
Well, for me, I think the obvious reasons would be the nature of the geography, I mean, the nature of the land, the climate, whatever. Also, the history that it evolves, that it starts. And I think demography has a huge impact on this. And resource endowment, depending on how they. So in the Chinese case, for instance, it's always been along the rivers agriculture, which needed control of irrigation, which needed a strong state because it needed to collect labor to control the waters, because the Yellow River, which is where Chinese civilization started, has the highest rate of siltation in the world. So in many places, it will overflow its banks and cause destruction if you don't build up the dikes. So today, in many places, the Yellow River, the river itself, is flowing about 70 feet above the ground level, because over time, you built the dikes and the rivers kept going up. And then you need to control the irrigation, share the water, do all that. That requires a big state. Wittfogel used to call it actually Oriental despotism, but he said it was founded on control of water there and in northern Sri Lanka, Anuradhapura and so on. But I don't know to what extent, but it's clear that because of their resource endowment, they've always had a strong state to take care of these kinds of. But in our case, it wasn't. We are in one of the most fertile places on earth. I mean, we have more as area. India is about 1/3 China. China is about 9.6 million square kilometers. India is about 3.28 million square kilometers. But we have more arable land than China does. In fact, they are only 2/3 the arable land that we possess. Even though you look at China on a map, it's very big. So it evolved differently. If you look at it, power was always much more devolved. I mean, even in the centralized empires, the Mughals and so on, I mean, they did a land settlement and they distributed taxes and somebody else collected it and gave you his share. And that was it.
Also,
it wasn't one state structure with a civil service, all from the center. So this is the nature of the land, right?
Also, in a lot of your speeches, I have observed that you kind of use a pronoun like she for this country, for China. What's the difference? And there are countries which are, you mention, you give a male symbolic.
I think no difference. It's just what people have used for years, for centuries actually.
It has no significance in terms of.
Not really. I mean, I'm not trying to be politically correct and equal gender. No, that's not what I mean, it's just a pronoun, and it's a pronoun they've used. I mean, Germans always say fatherland, and they always have.
And certain countries say motherhood.
Motherland.
Motherland, huh?
But France, for instance, personifies France as Marianne, as a lady, as a young lady. So different countries have, we say Bharat Mata, mother. So I think different countries just choose different pronouns, and it's a matter of habit. I don't think you can find a logic to it.
So there are certain countries which are perceived to be powerful, right? Why does it happen?
Well, I don't think it's about perception. Perception is useful up to a point. But ultimately, hard power is only two things, military and economic. And that is easily measured. So I think hard power is easy. It's when you come to influence.
The soft power.
It's not even soft power so much as the ability to create outcomes. Does not depend only on hard power. I mean, the most powerful states on the world have also failed. There are limits to what power can achieve.
What are those limits?
And very simple. I mean, the Vietnam War shows you the limits. Afghan War shows you the limits of stupendous military power, but it cannot create political outcomes.
Why does it happen?
Because politics is more than just a military outcome. It's not just controlling the place or threatening people or killing people. Politics is about creating something that works, which involves other people. So if those people are not going to participate, whatever you do, it doesn't help.
Give us an example in Indian context where, using soft power or
well, you look at, very simple. When the Myanmar trouble, there was a coup, the military took over, and then you started getting refugees across the border in Mizoram. Center, which is much, much more powerful than Mizoram, said, close the border. Mizoram, the people said, rubbish. These are all our brothers and cousins. We marry with the same tribe. You call them Chin there, here they are Mizos. But it's the same tribe, same. So we're not going to close the border. How can we deny our cousins and brothers and sisters and so on refuge when they need it? So 40,000 people crossed the border in about 3 weeks and came and settled in Mizoram, and they'll go back when things get calm because that's their home, that side. But so now, again, the center says we'll build a fence on the Myanmar border. They announced a few weeks ago. Mizoram had said, no, we don't want any fence. Now, there's a huge imbalance of power. Logically, if you went only by power, how can Mizoram dare to say no? They depend on the center for almost everything, for money, for etc. But they can. And that's the difference between politics and just sheer force. And there are limits to the utility of force. And I think people forget this. There's limits even to economic power. As you've seen, there are so many sanctions on Russia. But has it stopped her from doing what she's doing in Ukraine? No, if she's determined, she will. She pays a price, but she's willing to. She sees it as part of the price and sees this as a bigger gain than the price she's paying. So these are much more complicated. That's why IR is interesting, right? Because if it were simple, just to calculate who's more powerful, who's this, who's that, then you could predict everything and you could go home and, there's not much. But actually, life is complicated, and that's the joy of it, that things can be negotiated, that you can try and understand more complex processes, and that you always know there's a little bit more, there's something more out there that is worth studying and learning.
But I want to delve deeper on this idea. Tell us, how can an individual person use soft power when, there are times when you're not powerful either economically or with bronze, with the military power and stuff. How do you navigate through the situation?
IR theory will tell you that there are 3 ways of dealing with an imbalance of power. One is balancing. So you find somebody else who has your interest and who balances this overwhelming power that you are facing if you want to. So you find some ally,
Give us an example also. Make it real
for
us.
Find a friend, for instance. Why are we in the Quad? Because we all feel that piece of ocean should stay open, the Indo-Pacific, and that nobody should claim it for their own. Chinese have claimed it for their own, but you, as part of the Quad, are making sure that it's open, that it follows the rules. Right?
Aligned incentives,
and
so you find a friend.
Balanced the rise of China by working with other friends. So that's balancing is one. The other is bandwagoning. If it's inevitable, then work with whoever it is, this huge power, whoever it is. Work with them. Then you bandwagon with them. You can hedge also. You can create reverse leverage.
Give us an example of
against somebody. No, very simple. On the border, for instance, if he comes across in one place, you go across in some other place. and you've created a hedge. So then you tell him, if he says, no, no, what are you doing? Then you say, what are you doing? And so then you negotiate, but you've created something in order to hedge against what he's doing. And once he knows that you can do this, he'll think twice before moving, right? So you've also created deterrence in his mind. So at core, it sounds simple, but it's obviously much more complicated than this. And I mean, hedging, for instance, for a very long time, the security order in East and Southeast Asia, in maritime Asia, was based on the US. I mean, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, they all had individual defense treaties with the US, Philippines, or Singapore, etc. And they all depended on US military power for their security. But then US commitment became doubt. You know, under Trump, you don't know, will they come, will they perform what they want? So if you look at it over time, suddenly all these countries, from India all the way to Japan, are now cooperating much more together in defense, in intelligence, in security. Why? Partly it's to balance the rise of China, but it's also to hedge against the US not being there and not performing the functions that she used to perform and provide security on the global commons. So it's never a simple calculus. I mean, there's always bits and pieces of other moving parts. And because politics keeps changing, governments change, people's attitudes change, their interests change. I mean, today India has interests across the world, which we didn't have when we became independent.
And what made that
So,
change?
as we developed, as we got bigger, as we got much more integrated into the world economy. So today, it really, what we do matters. So that's the dynamic, which is, for me at least, the interesting part. But it's not simple. And it keeps evolving, which is the nice part.
And all of these strategies are, it's not a clear, field where you have a full vision of everything, every move. It's
You
very
don't
uncertain.
know everything. You're working in fog.
Right.
And so also what you're trying to do then is you try and maximize gain and minimize harm. But in most such cases, it's never a simple choice. It's never, oh, this is good and this is successful. Politics is a process. Things don't end. There's no engineering solution to a problem in politics. You can change the nature of the problem. You can make it benign from something that's malign. You can make it, but you can't just, you look at, not a very good example, but you look at the LTT problem in Sri Lanka when the LTT was there. You wanted to prevent, the LTT was a terrorist group, they'd killed an Indian prime minister. You didn't want that to spread, certainly not among the Tamils, either on both sides of the straits or anywhere. But you didn't want Tamils to suffer as a result, right? So when the Sri Lankan army is defeating the LTT in 2008, 2009, what do?
You send and support.
You support the Tamil people. You make sure that you supply food to the people. You make sure that you use your influence with the Sri Lankans to say, don't go around bombing Tamil cities just because they're Tamil. Target the LTT if you want. But don't do this. And the LTT would use their people as human shields. As they withdrew, they took more and more civilians with them. So you can't then use heavy weapons against them. So you try, now there's no perfect solution to this, right?
Try to optimize.
So you optimize gain, you maximize gain and minimize harm. And you're operating without full knowledge of what. You don't know at that moment whether they'll actually win. I mean, you can guess. You might say there's a 70% probability. But you don't know 100% what they'll pull out. And you can never predict odd things like somebody's assassination, something, and that can change the situation. So this is why it's complex. You're working in fog. In hindsight, everything looks very simple. Arey, why didn't they do this? Silly people, they should have known. But that's 2020 hindsight.
Also, there is a lot of uncertainty, as you mentioned. With an example of a story or an anecdote, while you were also there on ground while the Indian-China conflict during 1986 and 87. Is that true?
86, I was there, yeah.
Yes. Walk us through that. Let's go to that day.
Well, we didn't have a conflict in 86. In 86, what happened was we discovered that the Chinese had come across the line and created a permanent outpost on our side of the high watershed in the eastern sector, near east of Tawang, actually, in a place called, the Chinese call it Wangdong, we call it Sumdrongchu. We use the Tibetan word for that river. And so we moved troops up, and they were within meters of each other in a face-off. And then it took a long time to negotiate that.
How do you do
But
that?
But it became much more than just a negotiation about one face-off. It became a negotiation about the nature of the relationship. And finally, Rajiv Gandhi visited China in December 88, and we agreed a basic modus vivendi that, look, we'll discuss and settle all these kinds of issues peacefully. And we set up an expert group and we started. Separately, we will cooperate where we can, because until then we weren't even, trade was something like $200 million or something. So we said, like, trade, and we'll cooperate on the international stage where we have common interests, whether in WTO or whether in the climate change negotiations and so on. So we'll change the nature of the relationship from one where, since the 62 war, we had not been talking, where we were confrontational, we had no mechanisms to deal with face-offs and all these situations. Then we started the process of the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement in 93. All that process started. So that was in some ways the trigger for changing the nature of how we both dealt with the relationship. We didn't settle the boundary problem. But we found ways of managing it and living with it. And it kept the peace and it kept the border the way it was for almost 30 years. Until this decade, the last decade, when from 2013 onwards, the Chinese started changing their behavior.
What changed? What changed?
I think politically also they had developed much more. And so I think they decided that they wanted to show also the nature of the relationships had changed. Their relationship with the US has deteriorated steadily in the last decade. And our relationship with the US has got better and better. And I think they were convinced that they wanted to, in 2020, when they did what they did in Galwan and along the whole line, actually, I think what they were trying to do was to show us both that, that we should deal with China straight rather than depend on the US, or, the US shouldn't depend on us. I think that was what they tried. It didn't work. I mean, not 100%. Worked to some extent, but I mean, we're still not patrolling everywhere where we were before, but basically it didn't work. So it's still now a political impasse. If you look at it, there are over 100,000 troops up there in the western sector. They've spent 3 winters up there, and there's no sign that they won't have to spend more. So politically, at least, your relationship is in a jam now. Economically, you're still trading, all that is going on.
How does it happen? In one way, politically you're in jam, and economically you're keeping things going.
This is the problem. This is what people keep saying. But the fact is that Chinese goods keep prices down in India, and Indian consumers need them. So you can't tell Indians, no, now you stop eating because there's trouble with China on the border.
Issue.
And actually, the share of Chinese goods in our exports has risen considerably in the last 15, 20 years. So there is advantage to us in getting spare parts, so on, from China, putting it together, exporting it to the world. We make, so we are part of the same global supply chains. And a lot of it is explained by that.
Also, tell us, what's your first, reaction when you hear, let's say you're leading the national security of the country, right? And you got to know that there has been an attack. Some neighboring country has tried to cross your borders, infiltrate, whatever. What's your first reaction? How do you see that?
Well, you have plans for
Can you
all
take
this.
us to the...
No, you can't, because you have plans for most of these contingencies. nobody can foresee the future, but what you can do is you prepare scenarios and you ascribe probability to it. And then you make plans for all these situations. And somebody crosses the border, then how has he crossed? Why has he crossed? Is he sitting or has he just come and gone? I mean, what do you do? So it all depends on the situation. But you will have plans for all these. And you'll then start.
Execute.
No, not just execute. First, you'll establish the facts.
Okay.
I mean, you have to, you can't, it's not automatic. But you would have thought these, that's what you have these huge structures for. And to think these things through beforehand, and then to be at least prepared. So then you can see, when you know the actual facts, you can deal with it. Because nobody can predict everything right before, right? So, and then you'll look at the situation at that time and you'll decide what to do.
So you're saying that every country has a standard operating procedure?
No. I think big countries and serious countries have. But some countries will have much less resources, much less capability. They will probably not. They might have a few people who are trained in these things. They might not have. So it varies. So you can't say across the board everybody has or everybody does the same thing. And each one does it differently.
I don't want war, sir, but I'm just curious. Just because you mentioned that we have thought through all the possibilities.
Not all. I never say all. We have thought through scenarios and we'll see what happens. We'll see if it fits into one of our scenarios. Otherwise, we'll see where it diverges and then we'll look at what we do. So you can't predict 100% before what's going to come. But you can think systematically about these things, build the capabilities so that you have the tools to deal with these problems when they arise.
So all our neighboring countries, most of the neighboring countries have nuclear, many of our, Pakistan, China, they have nuclear weapons. Oh, and we have not.
We have many more neighbors. We have Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh,
Considerably
Sri
smaller
Lanka.
and unthreatening.
Bangladesh, 200 million people. I mean, it's not a small country. Myanmar, these are big countries.
But it's not seemingly a threat to India.
But because it doesn't have nuclear weapons?
Because, we kind of support them in.
One thing in IR, you can't assume that anybody is your permanent friend or your permanent threat or a permanent enemy.
Then how do you?
You can't. You operate on the basis of what the situation is today and your expectation for the future.
You don't see the past? We don't see how they have reacted to us?
Tells you where you are today, because without the past, you wouldn't know, you wouldn't be here. So you know the past in order to understand where you are today. But you're not doing an academic history. You're interested in where has it led us and what does it give us to deal with this now.
What will a country like India do if one of our neighbors, pull off the.
These kinds of, these hypotheticals, these are too vague. Because nobody just pulls off a nuclear weapon. It's, you build, it takes a long process. It's a complicated thing. How are they building it? What are they building? Are they really building it? All that we see. So these are decisions that people will take, but they'll take it on the basis of informed knowledge and they'll go into much more detail than just saying, oh, they have a weapon, it's a good thing, it's a bad thing. That is not how they'll look at it. At least I hope not.
You mentioned that you don't assume that anybody is your friend, enemy.
There are no permanent friends and enemies in the world.
And is it true for an individual level also?
No, of course not. Because the international society is anarchic. But at the individual level, you don't live in an anarchic society. There are laws, there are customs, there's traditions, there's relationships. But international society is composed of equal sovereign states. They might be unequal in power, but theoretically at least, they're all absolutely sovereign and it's anarchic. There's no enforcement of international law. There's no international policeman who goes around saying, oh, you broke the law, why have you done this? So it can't be the same at the individual level as it is for the state.
I see so many photos with, political leaders, presidents and everyone. If you have to tell me.
Actually, these are only, the countries where I was ambassador, where I was presenting credentials. And that's really all. And people some of the people, only Manmohan Singh and Pranab Mukherjee, who I worked closely with. and Vajpayee, I think, because there aren't that many. I mean,
But you have a photo with Xi Jinping, Barack
Xi
Obama.
Jinping, because when I was doing the boundary, he asked to see me. That was before he became president in 2011.
Has he changed after being a
I
president?
have no idea. I'd be surprised because I don't think he would, I don't think he'd necessarily change.
And what
Barack
did you learn
Obama,
from him?
we were doing actually some of the negotiating, and he walked in. Many of those people actually are now in. Bill Burns is there, who is now the director of the CIA. There's Tom Donilon, who is their NSA. I mean, they became friends because we worked together. So, I mean, like here, this is Brajesh Mishra, Shyam Saran, and M.K. Narayanan. So, I mean, these are all people I worked with. That's it.
If you have to tell us one thing which is common across all these political leaders, people who lead countries, people who take care of, securities of countries. Is there something?
You must remember, I mean, when I joined the Foreign Service, I had no idea what the Foreign Service was. So I asked my father, what do I do? Or how do I? He said, don't worry about the job, you'll learn. I mean, they'll teach you in the ministry. But remember, whoever you deal with, president, chauffeur, whatever, they're all human. Deal with them as human beings. And you know the variation among human beings. So there is nothing that you can say all these people have in common. No. I mean, they're human beings. And maybe what they have in common is a desire for power, to actually be in power and rule and so on. But each one will have his own motivations for why they want it. Each one has a different trajectory. And human beings' variation is tremendous, So it's very hard to, and I think it's dangerous to oversimplify. Because you are dealing with them directly, right? And you want to either get what you want, or you want to get them to do what you want. And if you start making assumptions which are wrong, you lose. So don't make a priori assumptions. Just deal with them like another human being, which is what they are.
But there are personas, they are trying to fake something certain times. How do you
It doesn't matter.
that?
If they're trying to fake, use it. That's okay. That's fine. I mean, let them fake if they want. But human beings know it when you fake. I mean, when a teacher stands up in classroom and doesn't know his stuff, you know.
Yes.
You might not say anything. You might go to sleep in the back of the class, but you know. So most people know when people are trying to fake it or trying to, and especially, it's interesting. Mearsheimer, the political scientist, IR scholar, he wrote a book called Why Leaders Lie. And he studied 500 years of history. And he came to the conclusion that leaders very seldom lie to other leaders abroad. Internationally, leaders don't lie. Why? Because the other people are not under your control. They can see through it and they will make you pay for it very quickly. But they lie a lot to their own people in domestic politics because they think they can control this environment and they have the levers of power, whether it's the media, whether it's this, that, and the other. And he says this is not because of technology today or anything. He says this is true for 500 years of history. It's been like that. But that's not the general impression, right? People say, oh, diplomats are sent to lie abroad for the country. That's not true. Because what does a diplomat have? He has credibility. The other person will listen to him. He's not carrying a gun to shoot him. So he can't force people to do what he wants.
Right.
I mean, he might have the threat of force, but right now it's his credibility that matters. And so therefore lying is not the best way to establish credibility.
And you mentioned they have varied quantum of...
They would have come with different educations, different understandings of what the world is, how it works. Their experiences will be very different.
And is desire...
And when you look at leaders, I mean, just you look at our, three prime ministers. I mean, you look at Vajpayee, look at Manmohan Singh, look at Modi. Are they similar people?
Very stark difference.
Look at the difference. Yeah. And yet they're all Prime Minister of India, they ran India. And in many respects, they followed very similar policies. Every government says I'm unique and better and new, but ultimately Indian policy has been fairly consistent, steadily.
And what was those consistent?
Well, I mean, foreign policy, you look at whether you call it non-alignment or strategic autonomy or multi-directional policy, ultimately what are you doing? The same. What did you do when Ukraine happened? You positioned yourself in the middle somewhere, right? What did non-alignment do? Same thing. Ultimately, because India's interests are relatively unique. Show me another country which is as big, as influential, but still as poor, as concentrated on its own development as India. There isn't another. There's nobody else who shares your interests or your geography or your history 100%, which is why you don't have allies. That's why you're non-aligned, because you're unique. There is an exceptionalism to India. But you need the world. As I said at the beginning, you can't develop India, transform India without the world. You can't do it on your own. So you will find this in-between position, right? The balance between internal, external. And you will be involved in the world, but you will be involved in a unique way, your own way. That's what strategic autonomy, non-alignment, you can use any word. Every government will use new words to show that they are different. It's democratic competition, you must. That's okay. But, so, I mean, that's common. You look at the use of force, it's common across the board. I mean, we have used force from day one
But they
across our
mentioned,
borders.
Yuri strike and other
Each
things
one will,
happened.
yeah, but I mean, everyone has done that. Every previous government has gone across borders, has used force across borders, and created outcomes which work for them. So this, yes, each government claims we are unique and so on. That's okay. That's in democracy, it happens. But there are continuities, basic continuities, which come from your situation. And those will continue. But you can't ascribe them to the people. As I said, you look at the contrast in the people, how different their personalities are. But it's because of the nature of the state, the nature of India, the situation, and the interests of the country.
Also, I was hearing one of the speeches of your colleague, I don't know how, Mr. Ajit Doval, and he was saying, things have changed, our policies have changed, we have become more offensive, defensive, and stuff like that. Do you agree with that thought?
I think they might want to, and certainly we have more capabilities today than we had 20 years ago or 40 years ago. But whether we are more offensive or defensive should not depend on just because I want to be more defensive or offensive. It should depend on if there's an opportunity in the situation. And there is more opportunity in today's situation to be active abroad.
Because of?
Because there is a less settled international order. Because the international order itself is breaking down. And also because your interests are now abroad. In a sense, in a way that, I mean, why is the Indian Navy so active in the Red Sea against the Houthis? It's not the first time. When there were pirates out of Somalia, after 2008, we were there. When in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was piracy off the Malacca coast, Malacca Straits, again, the Indian Navy was there, working with the Singaporeans, the Indonesians, Malaysians, and their navies. So it's not the first time we're doing it. But today we can send more ships than we've ever done before. We have the capability. And more people expect us to do more because we are much more developed than we were before. So yes, but it should be a function of the situation rather than, I want to look good or I want to impress people at home, which to my mind is not a rational way of looking at it because that can lead you into mistakes. But there is no question that you will do more as you gain more capabilities. And that's the name of the game, to increase India's options, capabilities too.
And how was your time in Israel, sir?
Well, we enjoyed it. We were lucky. We went when there was a active peace process. Rabin was prime minister when I went. He was assassinated soon after, but there was still hope with Yasser Arafat, Rabin, Shimon Peres, and a peace process that was going on. Now, of course, the situation is very different.
And how do you plan
And at that time, for us, I was the second ambassador. We just opened an embassy a few years before my
Which year
period.
was this?
I went in 95. We opened the embassy in 92. PK Singh was the first ambassador, and the relationship was booming. I mean, in every way, agriculture, water management, defense, all these things. So it was, and for me, it was my first ambassadorship. So it was a good, exciting time.
Did you
And
make
a
any
lot
blunder?
I'm sure I did. I'm sure I did, but nothing. I think nothing that big that I had to undo it or regret it. I mean, luckily, I. But I'm sure I made mistakes. But people also know that if you do it out of goodwill, out of best intentions, most people will put up with it, or at least find a way around it.
Mhm. And you were also there in Pakistan, sir.
Yeah.
You mentioned that while you became the ambassador to Israel, the prime minister was assassinated, and there are certain hard times in countries like Pakistan and other countries. Did you fear about something?
In Pakistan, it was interesting. I went because Mr. Vajpayee's hand of friendship, he spoke
Yes.
in Srinagar about insaniyat and the hand of friendship to Pakistan. And
But Pakistan has done.
and we hadn't had a high commissioner for a while. It was soon after the parliament attack, failed Agra summit, etc., etc. So yes, I wasn't sure actually how far Pakistan would respond, and especially Musharraf and the Pak army. Was I nervous? Physically, yes and no. I mean, the threat that there was from the Pakistani state, not from anybody else. But since the Pakistani state was the one which had made the promises about terrorism, and we were starting a process, a peace process of sorts, comprehensive dialogue we were going to start. Within 4 months of my going there, we agreed the ceasefire, the first one, which is working even now. And then Mr. Vajpayee came in January 2004, within 6 months, to the SAARC summit in Islamabad. So, we were busy trying to change the nature of the relationship and move it forward. And I think we were relatively successful for a while, for at least those 3 years when I was there. And in December 2004, something like 14,000 Pakistani school children visited India, stayed in Indian homes, and went home during their vacation, which means our parents trusted us with their children, which tells you something. So, I always say that we as India, and especially as a representative of India, there are many Pakistans. We don't have a problem with ordinary Pakistanis, with civil society, or with businessmen. Even in the state, civilian politicians can go either way. They don't. You have problems with the deep state, with the Pakistan army, which has an institutional interest and hostility with India, and the jihadi tanzeems and so on, the extreme. But even the religious parties, Fazlur Rahman, all of them used to come quite happily to our house, talk to us.
There have been singers, artists.
All that, of course. That is because there are cultural affinities and so on. So I think one needs to look at it as a little more complicated than just, Pakistan. This is why I keep saying it's not one Pakistan that you're dealing with. And there will always be, there will be those parts which sponsor terrorism. There will be those parts who want to trade, travel, and be friends. And so it's complicated. I think as long as you're doing something positive, you don't have time to hang around worrying about, oh, am I safe? Am I going to be attacked? And
Were you ever attacked?
no, never, no. We had officers who were, detained, this, that, and the other. All that happened, but that's the normal India-Pakistan stuff. It's not, but I was never, no.
You mentioned about relationship, allies, and other things. What do you think? What's the current situation with all our allies and other stuff? And how do you think we can do better? And is there a role of a citizen in that?
There is certainly, especially in the neighborhood. Because the relationship with neighbors like Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so on, even Myanmar, is basically, and Pakistan also, ultimately, it's the relationship between citizens which makes all the difference. The state, as you said, has problems, the Pakistani state, especially those who rule in Pakistan and want some hostility with India. So, in that case, deal with the other people. But who deals with the other people? Not the Indian state is not good at doing that kind. So it should be civil society organizations, it should be other people who are businessmen, should be trading, you should be encouraging, and therefore the role of the citizen becomes very important in these kinds of relationships, especially in the subcontinent where you have affinities of every kind: language, religion, culture, food, you name it, dress.
How can we do better?
But that's where citizens need to actually show some sensitivity, get involved in the relationship, and a lot of it happens anyway. When you look at students come, go, learn about each other. So for me, that part actually is the best part of South Asia. We have more affinities than most other sub-regions in the world, and it's the citizens who keep it going. Whether it's music, whether it's not the state actually has not in most cases state has not actually contributed as much.
Also, tell us, you've worked extensively with Mr. Manmohan Singh. How was it? How is he as a boss? What are certain things that you learned from him?
He's a very easy person to work with, but he's also at heart a professor. So when you meet with him, you always leave the room with a little more than you went in. You learn something or the other, and his knowledge is really deep on most issues, because he's also been in public life for a long time. And he's thought quite deeply about these issues. And it's interesting because he, Mr. Vajpayee and Narasimha Rao, all have been in Delhi at the center of things for many years, for many decades. They really knew not only how it worked, but they also had thought through what was best for India. And one thing I saw with all three of them was they would never say, oh, this is good for my party or this is good for me and my election. They always asked, what's in our national interest? The question was always simple. Do you think it's in our interest? Our meaning the national interest. Always. Which for me was reassuring,
Tell us certain specific instances.
But then, I'm a apolitical civil servant, right? And it's not my business to worry about their political party and what they do. I'm sure they did that separately. But we always kept it separate.
How do you ensure
and which is why, if you think of it, Narasimha Rao sends me to Israel, Gujarat sent me to Sri Lanka, Vajpayee sent me to Pakistan, China, and Manmohan Singh brought me back. So, I'm an apolitical civil servant. I worked for all of them in an era of coalition governments.
But how do you keep yourself, you have to form your opinion as a diplomat.
Yeah, but you're forming an opinion, you serve the country, right? You have to remember always, I serve the country. I swore an oath to serve the country and the constitution. I didn't serve an oath to serve the Prime Minister or the government of the day.
Of 100%, but still you have to form your opinions, right?
But I form them, they're my opinions.
How do you,
and I have the right
separate those while you are working for the country?
Separate from what?
Separate from, how do you keep yourself apolitical? While you know that the person you are dealing with is from a particular...
That's why they have to do that thinking about what's political, how it works for them politically. And that's not my problem. I will tell them what I think is right. You have to speak truth to power. And frankly, any leader who's good wants you to tell them the truth. Because there are enough people in Delhi who will tell you what they think you want to hear. And especially in the political system. There are people who will say whatever they, and this jihazuri culture is very strong. But any good leader knows that this is dangerous because he's being cut off from reality.
And they're putting in the echo chambers.
Exactly. So he wants the honest truth. So give it to them. Give it to them politely, give it to them quietly. Don't go out and say, oh, I told him. But tell him the truth. And if they're any good, they will want it. And they will work with it. They may not do what you say, but they are the ones who take the responsibility.
What are certain other things that you have observed from great leaders?
I don't know. I think this is one very important, that they stay grounded, that they understand the value of listening to opinions. But I think also many of them have, at least the ones I worked with, had a very clear idea that India must transform, must become a modern
power.
Not so much power as a country where every citizen has an opportunity to lead a full life. Power is, that is neither here nor there. If your people are starving, you can be a power.
So what will you do with that?
But what's the use of the power? I mean, the purpose of politics is not power.
Then?
No. The purpose of politics is to actually improve the nature of your own country and your own people, right? Their welfare. Yoga Kshema, what is Kautilya telling you? What is Yoga Kshema? It's the welfare of your people. That's the goal.
Got it. So there are two more things that we would like to cover, sir. Number one, on the part of, so there is no way for us to learn from Mr. Vajpayee. We hear his speeches, hear his passion, and the thing of being apolitical, a lot of things where national interests come first and they don't think about which political party they belong to.
No, I'm sure they think, but it never entered into my dealings with them.
I understand. So, but the thing is, there is no way we can learn from Mr. Vajpayee, but we can learn from him because of you, because you've worked with him. Tell us certain things.
I think there's enough of what Mr. Vajpayee said, thought, and so on the public record. I think now there's a lot more. There's scholarship on his period also. So I think now one can learn. There's enough distance now that we can be objective and we can choose and learn.
But do you remember certain incidents that you clearly, distinctively remember right now, which kind of shaped your opinion about the person, about Mr. Vajpayee, or Mr. Gujral, or Mr.
No, I think, that's... Frankly, no, I don't think I can think of any incident like that. And I don't like talking about personalities like that.
Why is that?
It's a private relationship. That's nothing to do with what we did.
Makes sense. Also, tell us about future and the AI thing, which is a buzzword now. How is it affecting IR, the world of international relations?
Well, it's already there. I mean, it's clearly... But to me, AI right now, and since we don't have a fully self-sustaining generative AI fully yet, right now AI is just, is what computers did for us, what typewriters did for us. It's another tool which makes us more efficient, and it helps us to a certain extent. But there are some things that it cannot do now, and that I'm not sure that it will ever be able to do.
For example?
For example, I think AI can probably negotiate with itself. So you can put two AIs at a table to negotiate. I'm not sure it can negotiate with people, because there is a point beyond which you need that human connection to actually arrive at an outcome. And what's a diplomat's goal in an outcome? It's not just to win. Because if you win everything and leave the other person with nothing, he has no interest in implementing your agreement. He will go home and spend the rest of his life trying to overthrow the agreement. That's exactly what happened at Versailles after World War I, where you left Germany with no interest in this. They had to pay money, and they spent the rest of it trying to break the treaty, trying to gain the power to destroy it. So your job is to create an agreement where you maximize your gain, but you must give him enough to be interested and vested in it.
You leave something on the table.
There has to be something for him also. Not on the table, but for him. Or her, whatever. But so, and how do you craft that? In order to do that, you must judge intent. And AI, all these technical means, can figure out capability, but it can't judge human intent.
And how do you judge human intent?
Exactly. That only human beings can do.
How do you do that?
You don't. There's no 100%. Nobody can tell you, I know exactly what he thinks.
But how do you try?
You have a sense, right? And that's why you go through a negotiation, so that you come to an understanding of each other's. You also want him to understand you. And you come to an understanding, but in the process you try and maximize what you get, but you must give him something. In order to give him something worth it, to make him cooperate, you have to find something that means something to him, which means you have to understand what means something to him and his priorities, his bias, which won't be the same as yours. So there is a point beyond which I'm not sure. Maybe it will. I mean, I don't know how AI is going to develop, what will happen in the next 10, 15 years. But today, it's only a tool. Yes, it can write a few briefs for us. You know, it can simplify your daily life, your working. It can produce standard documents that you need to produce. You know, maybe it can check things for you. It can produce data if you want. It's good at doing those kinds of things. But that's not the game. And that's not the entire game.
How do you
So when people say that, you know, every time anything happened, they always said, oh, now diplomacy is finished. Telephone has come, you know, what do we need diplomats for? Heads of missions have summits now. What's the point? Heads of government, they meet in summits, so what's the point? And yet, there's more and more diplomats and more diplomacy, more and more conferences. I mean, each time, it's like, you know, the same story with newspapers. Then radio was supposed to kill newspapers, and you had both. Then, you know, television was supposed to kill both these. Nothing. Video was going to kill everything else, nothing. You know, today we watch all of them at the same time, and we're streaming, and we're. So these are, for me, technologies. And like all technologies, it will be used for the same things that all technologies are used for, to control other people, to make war, to make money. And they'll do that. I mean, and so AI will be used, and ultimately it'll get normalized. But with every new technology, you hear the same thing. Oh, it must be controlled. It's very dangerous. When aircraft came, everyone said, this is very dangerous. We must set up a world organization. All aircraft will belong to it, and they'll only be used because otherwise they'll bomb cities and, you know, people will die. It's very dangerous. Radio, they said, must be controlled. This is very dangerous. Who knows who will use it? Some terrorists, you know, in those days, anarchists. And we need a world government regulation, this, that.
On radios.
On radio. For aircraft, they were going to be banned. And just like they did for nuclear weapons, right? They said, no, we can't allow it to spread, very dangerous. Can't trust people with this. So I think we go through this cycle with technology. AI, everyone says, is different. It's more than any other change. Maybe, maybe not. But it hasn't been proved yet.
But which is a.
For diplomacy, at least, I think it's a very good tool. Please use it. But, you know, it's not going to take over our lives, I don't think.
And what is your most favorite aircraft?
Aircraft? Why?
Because you mentioned about aircraft.
I don't know. No, I don't have a favorite aircraft.
Have you ever have a chance to, you know, sit into a fighter airplane?
Sat in them, but no, I don't have a favorite aircraft.
Okay. Also, you mentioned a very interesting point about you use certain techniques to control other people, to make more money. And what was the third thing?
And make war. And I mean, all of these technologies you use for.
Only these three things.
No, well, these are the three big categories of things you use them for. I mean, most things come under one of these three categories.
And so these are the main drivers of, you know, human desire?
I think so. I think so. And they manage. I'm oversimplifying. I mean, obviously, life is much more complicated than all this. But I'm just saying, in these large baskets is where you'll see most of. I mean, you look at climate change, for instance, and renewable energy. And for most countries, they're unwilling to enter into any binding commitment. But they will all try and build an industry of renewable energy, whether it's China and solar, China and wind, etc., etc. In other words, what are we doing? We see that this shift as an opportunity, as an economic opportunity, building an industry and creating. But we won't commit to 1 degree. We won't say, when we go to Paris, we say big agreement. What's the agreement? I will tell you what I will do, but you cannot check on what I do. That's not a binding international agreement, at least to my mind.
Of course.
But that's so ultimately, we react in very similar ways as societies, as international societies, and we react in similar ways to these problems. And that's why I say this. But I'm oversimplifying. Each technology will be much more complicated than this. And some will develop in some ways, some will be, But now, increasingly, there's less and less sort of purely military technologies and increasingly, they're less and less concentrated in the state. I mean, space, nuclear were big science. So it needed investment by the state. Manhattan Project and so on. It took, 1/3 of the electricity of the US or something at one stage. But today, IT, I mean, this is done in garages by individuals. So it's no longer, it might be controlled by a few big corporations, but the technology itself is actually out there. So how it happens will be different. I'm not saying that but if you look at the purposes, you look at people's reactions to it, there is a similarity in the way we respond.
I see. Also, when we are talking to a lot of friends, there are certain times when there are some people by default, they have a diplomatic nature, sir.
Meaning?
Meaning, answer to anything they don't
won't
want
commit.
to.
They won't commit.
Yeah, one is that. One is that they don't want to, they give diplomatic answers, right? And we want to understand from you, is being diplomatic good or bad? And
It depends on the circumstance. I mean, as I said, the key for a diplomat is credibility.
And how
So credibility means that the best, simplest way of establishing credibility is to tell the truth, right? But there is a point beyond which
you can't.
You don't say offensive truths necessarily.
Huh.
Because then your job is to get the other person to do what you want. Now, if you're busy calling him an idiot, he's not going to do what you want. It may be true.
Huh.
You might think he's actually a terrible fellow, but that doesn't mean you should tell him that. So there's the point. So when you say diplomatic, I assume that you still mean being truthful, but not necessarily revealing everything or bearing your heart and soul to somebody. To that extent, it depends on the circumstance, on what you're trying to do.
Give us one situation where you know that you are dealing with an idiot, but you can't call out that,
Well, for the last few years, we've been telling other countries that you have fallen into a debt trap with the BRI.
What's Bihari?
The Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese.
Of China's.
China. And we've been telling in public, we've been saying, oh, this is a debt trap and so on. But every time you say this is a debt trap to somebody who has received the money, you are saying you're a fool, but I know better. I can see this debt trap. You went and accepted the money.
Whether it's Sri Lanka or China or Pakistan or whatever.
Well, why will he listen to you after that? So you need to be a little diplomatic in the way you phrase it.
And how do you phrase it?
Either you talk to him beforehand and say, these are the dangers that I see. But then you know better, you figure it out for yourself. I'm sure you've figured it out. And leave it to him. Then let him make up his own mind. Or you make him a better offer, something that he can't refuse. I mean, there are many ways of dealing with this. But you telling him that this is a debt trap is not the best way. If you want to be effective, because your job is to create outcomes. Your job is not to be right, is not to say, I told you so. That's not your job. Your job is to create an outcome which works for you. And that requires his cooperation. And you don't get his cooperation by telling him, look, I'm smart enough. I saw it's a debt trap, but you were...
Not fool.
In effect, I mean, that's what you're saying to him. And he understands also. Even if he's a fool, he'll understand that much. So that's where I think diplomacy comes in. But it doesn't mean you don't tell the truth or that you lie. Not at all. Because that affects your credibility if he catches you out lying. So it's a fine calculus.
Also, as much as we want to understand internationalism, we also want to be a better human being.
Correct.
Tell us certain things that you learned from your diplomatic career which helped you in your personal life, in your relationships.
Work is work and personal is personal. And you shouldn't confuse the two. And so for me, these are separate things. How I choose to lead my personal life, the values I respect, what I choose to do, that has nothing to do with what I do at work. And it shouldn't. Because as I said, work deals with international society, which operates quite differently from society and from the domestic situation in which you are. So here you have a whole different set of constraints and human values and so on that you work on. But these values don't apply in the international situation, in the anarchy that is the outside world. So you can't take from one and say, I've learned, therefore I will do this in my personal life, or that what I do in my personal life I must do in my professional life. So I always said, and besides, work is work. It's a job, no matter what post you hold. That has nothing to do with your value or what you stand for.
Got it.
I mean, that for me is important, to be able to separate yourself from the job. I think too many people don't do that. And then when they retire, they're very unhappy because suddenly they've lost themselves when they've lost their job.
How is it important to
You
separate
see many retired people who are lost, right? Who somehow have lost a purpose. But if they had a personality, a personal life of their own, they wouldn't be worried about losing their job.
And do you have time to focus on your personal things when you're in a job?
You're always a person. I mean, you can't stop being a person. There's no, and that's why I say that distinction is important.
How did you create that distinction for yourself?
Well, I don't know how or why I did it, but it just came to me. I mean, it's because I never thought the job was me. I never thought the title was me. I don't know. I mean, but I do honestly think that you do the job better by doing that. You also are a better person that way by not importing your job into your life.
And do you feel people changes their behavior when you lose a position? When you graduate from a position, you don't lose a position like that, but you graduate, you retire.
I think you do different things. I mean, you move on.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you need to be able to move on and say, okay, that's over, finished. Now let's go on.
You learned Mandarin?
I did.
You're selling in your college days?
I learned in university, yeah.
It's one of the hardest languages, they say.
Not really, not for an Indian, no. It's a pure test of memory, and it has minimal grammar. There's no I, me, my. There's no tense, there's no gender, there's no singular, there's no plural. So it's a pure test of memory. Either you know it or you don't know it. So it's actually, for me, the easiest language because we find it easy to memorize things. That's what we learned in school. So when people say, oh, very difficult language, yes, you have to remember more. But that's how children learn any language. Child doesn't learn his mother tongue by learning the grammar.
This is seeing by...
They swallow whole chunks, what they hear, which is why children sound like adults sometimes, and we say, oh, how cute. Because they just swallow the whole thing and they use it. And they're lucky when they use it right. It takes a while. It takes about 6-7 years for them to learn how to use it. But ultimately, that's how most people learn a language. And Chinese is exactly like that. You just learn it by heart. And that's it. And because you write it, each character is unique. So there's no system to learning how to write. Pronunciation, you have to know it or not know it. And you have to know the meaning. So for me, actually, when people say very difficult language, very different from other languages, and certainly from our language. I mean, the same word, character in Chinese can be a noun, can be a verb, can be an adverb, can be anything depending on its position in the sentence and context. But there's no, I, me, mine, none of all this. You don't have to conjugate the verb, you don't have to do anything like that. So it's actually much easier. It's an instinctive language.
And why should a 22-year-old watching this should learn Chinese?
That's up to them. Unless they're interested in China and Chinese, don't bother. Because it is, for some people, hard to learn. But if you're interested in it, if you think that Chinese could be useful to you in your life, try it and see. And you won't know until you try it. Because as I said, just because you found other languages easy or hard doesn't mean that it'll tell you how you'll react to Chinese. Because it's such a unique language.
There is no commonality between Sanskrit, Chinese, and other.
None at all. None at all. I mean, there's some borrowed words here and there, but no.
There are borrowed words.
Yeah, I mean, we borrowed so many. When you say chini, what do you say? You say chinapatta for silk. I mean, that's Chinese cloth. So there are words like that, loan words which both sides have borrowed from each other. Like Mandarin, many people say the word came from mantri, but via Malaysia, and then. But these ascriptions are hard. But basically, it's a unique language. That is true, and that's what I think. Because people come to it with all these assumptions, right? They think they can learn it like other languages.
Also, there are a lot of students who are fascinated by China, and they want to visit the country and want to. Is there a program, to your knowledge, where a college student can visit China, see their factories and stuff like that? And is there an exchange program like
As
that?
of now, I don't know of one because I think after COVID, I don't think all that has been restored yet.
Okay.
There isn't anything right now that is like that. And there are tours and so on, but that's not the same as what you were saying, which is actually going and seeing. But ideally, there should be some system of embedding of students going, spending 2-3 weeks, staying with a family or something. You know, the Americans used to have something called American Field Service for high school students, final year high school students, who would go and spend a month or even 6 months in an American home, attending an American school, and their children would come and stay in an Indian home and do this. It's a great system, actually.
If we have to establish one, who's the right person?
Well, you'll have to talk to MEA, I think. They'll have to talk to the Chinese state, will have to approve it. But they are the ones who could do this.
This was super insightful.
Thank you for this.
And really
Thank you
grateful.
very much.
I learned a lot, and I got a lot of thinking points, a lot of food for thought. And I have to go double click, digest. There were a lot of things that you spoke that I had no idea of. So I have to learn all those things.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.
Thanks a lot.